Hello, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the IUCN Species Survival Commission Shark Specialist Group Human Dimensions Working Group Workshop. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I would also like to thank all of our speakers of the day that will be presenting their work. My name is Paula Dominguez. I am volunteer of the Human Dimensions Working Group. I've been volunteering with them for over a year now. And I am one of the organizers of the group, together with Dr. Divya Karnad and Dr. Hollie Booth, the chairs of the Human Dimensions Working Group. Just a little bit of background about myself. I graduated from my master's in marine ecosystem management in 2021, and I've been working in conservation since then. I'm actually working in the Maldives as marine biologist, and I am very, very interested in all shark conservation. So just to start the workshop today, I would like to give you a little bit of information about how are we going to run the session. Today, we're starting at this time, but I just wanted to mention that tomorrow we will be starting at the same time at 11:30 GMT talking about the citizen science and how to use citizen science in conservation, okay? Today we will have the presentations from our experts, and we will have a Q&A session at the end. I wanted to mention about the day 4 of the workshop. This will be Thursday, 8th of June. I'd like to remind you that we will be starting 1 hour later on this day, so at 12:30 GMT. We will have different breakout sessions during this day, where we will have 3 different groups, each of them talking about each of the main topics that we will cover during the workshop, and we will be discussing and answering some more questions during the breakout groups on that day. Also, a little bit more information for you. If you have conducted any social science research in the human dimensions of sharks, rays, or chimeras, you are invited to participate in a focus group that we will be focusing on the goals, the challenges, and the future of the field. All the registered participants should have received already a very detailed email with all the information about this research and about the focus group. And there should be a link joining to a Google form that I encourage you to fill, please, if you are interested in this research and focus group. You will also find this link in the chat of the main stage that we will be putting in now, so you have it accessible and easy. So today, focusing on today, we're going to be talking about how to use and how to gather local ecological knowledge in shark conservation. For this aim, we have 3 speakers that will be talking about their experience on this field. We have Dr. Divya Karnad, Dr. Alifa Haque, and Trisha Gupta. If you have any questions that come up during the presentations, please, you can write them on the stage tab in the chat tab, like that we can see them. And we will bring them all up during the Q&A session at the end of the presentations. If we don't have time for all of them, we will follow with these questions on the breakout sessions on the last day of the workshop. So I would like you to introduce to our first speaker, Dr. Divya Karnad. She is the co-chair of the IUCN Shark Specialist Group Human Dimensions Working Group, and she's also an assistant professor at Ashoka University in India. Divya is a marine conservationist and geographer who works on fisheries and the conservation of threatened species, especially focusing on sharks and rays. For her PhD, she has studied indigenous practices on fisheries management and conservation in fishing communities in India. And she also co-founded In Season Fish, which is a sustainable seafood initiative. So today she will be talking about the diverse form of knowledge that we have on natural sciences. Thank you very much.
Hello. Today, I would like to discuss knowledge and its diversity. As a scientist, I was trained to think that only scientific knowledge was valid. And the reason that I thought this is because scientific knowledge was based on the scientific method. The scientific method is a standard, replicable, and widely acceptable way of gathering knowledge. which is based on you going out, observing things in the world, which make you curious. Then you ask questions. Then you try to find out if those questions have been answered before. And often the way that you do this is by reading. Reading often gives you various explanations for some aspect of the question that you're asking. And if your question has not been fully answered, you might have developed some hypotheses that kind of explain the answer to your question. Now, you can test these hypotheses by doing certain experiments or gathering data. And once you analyze the data, you can draw conclusions about your original question. Often these conclusions will lead you to more questions. And this is how the scientific method kind of leads to a step-by-step accumulation of knowledge. Now, when I was told about scientific knowledge, I was also told a couple of things about it, which is that it is objective, it is credible, like people believe that scientific knowledge is valid. It explains things very well because it uses this standardized method, and that it's broadly, applicable. But as I began to train as a scientist, I realized that all these assumptions about scientific knowledge were kind of brought or called into question when I actually started doing things in the field, in the real world. So the first point was about objectivity. As I started to interact with fishermen and shark fishermen, I realized that the way that I was observing the world, the kinds of things that made me curious, the way that I would go about trying to find out if my questions were answered, the kinds of things that I would read, the languages in which I was reading them, and what I would understand to be valid versus not valid, were all biased. They were biased by the language that I was reading in. They were biased by my culture. They were biased by the type of school that I went to and the type of training that I had. And so could I really call this being objective? The second point was about credibility. Certainly, I was taught that, science has to be replicable. But when I was out there working with fishermen, I realized that between when I did the work and when someone else wanted to repeat the work, a lot of things would have changed in the real world. And so the kind of science that I was doing wasn't really replicable. It was never going to be replicable. And if I wanted to assert the validity of my findings, I would have to do so just based on the pure fact that it was scientific. To someone who's not trained in the sciences, this seems like we're asking people to just believe that it's true, which is sort of the opposite of what science asks you to do. And so this was sort of creating a distance between experts who understood what the scientific method was all about, and therefore were willing to treat results as valid, versus non-experts who just could not understand the difference between, say, amateur observations and the scientific method. Another thing was about explanations. Science is supposed to provide explanations, but when I'm out there trying to understand what I can do to better conserve a particular species of shark, and there are fishing nets in the water, there's pollution, there are rivers being dammed, there is dredging. I mean, there are so many things going on. To use a kind of simplistic explanation, which is what the philosophies behind Western science ask us to do. I mean, what we call Occam's razor kind of suggests that the most simple explanation is often the best explanation. But in the real world, where things are so complex, these simplistic explanations often don't do a good enough job to help us get to some kind of applied solution. And this was something that was really frustrating me. And finally, in terms of applicability, I found that I just wasn't able to apply the scientific method in its true theoretical form when I went out into the field and was trying to do my research. Whether it was the lack of funding or the fact that I would ideally want to study, say, shark behavior in pristine conditions, but I was doing my research in India where there's a huge population of people and people's footprints are everywhere, whether we're talking about direct interactions in terms of fisheries or indirect interactions in terms of pollution. It's just not possible to treat the human effect as a sort of error term or a random effect or noise. One has to account for it in some way, and the scientific method just did not give me a way to be able to do this. So it sort of made for me, to ignore the power relationships, the politics, and the context. And this was not useful when I am trying to be out there doing science-based conservation or evidence-based conservation for sharks and rays. So instead, I began looking at what the fishing community that I was working with had to offer in terms of knowledge. And as I started reading up about this, I realized that there are different ways in which we can think about their knowledge. There are different terms that are being used, like local ecological knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous ecological knowledge, and also hybrid knowledges that sit somewhere between all of these things. And it's these hybrid knowledges often that we as shark scientists are interested in, because they give us a sense not only of what is happening right now in that particular location or of what different cultures are doing, but also a sense of history and what has happened in the past. So just to give you a brief introduction to what these different terms mean, let's start with traditional ecological knowledge, which is a term that has been around for the longest duration. It's also a term that refers to a body of knowledge or practice and belief that has accumulated over time and evolved through adaptive processes. It has been transmitted through cultural transmission across generation, and it concerns the relationship between living beings as well as between living beings and their environment. So it's a sort of all-encompassing term that has this time component to it, as compared to local ecological knowledge, which is about people's site-specific knowledge, which can be practically applied. And then there's indigenous ecological knowledge, which is the knowledge, innovations, and practices of indigenous and local communities around the world. As I said, to us as shark scientists, some of these specific differences don't make that much of a difference, because often we are interested in the sort of hybrid knowledge that sits and overlaps many of these different forms of knowledge. And we call that fisher ecological knowledge. But one has to think, when one is doing any kind of study about knowledge, one has to think about what knowledge itself is and what its characteristics are. So let's think a little bit about the philosophy of knowledge. Knowledge is sort of the way people think about and represent the world around them, all the things living and non-living that they interact with. Knowledge may be something that an individual has, and it also may be something that characterizes a group of people. And it comes through various forms of interactions and relationships and all kinds of things that we have with the world around us. Knowledge is always incomplete. And this is one of the challenges, which makes for a huge diversity in people's knowledge. It's also always changing. What is accepted as knowledge by different cultures is very contextual. So for instance, I would accept something that uses the scientific method as knowledge, whereas the fishermen that I was working with would accept things that come out of experience rather than books as being a valid form of knowledge. So based on your beliefs, you develop a particular type of knowledge, and this knowledge is based on your daily practices. So my daily practice has something to do with reading things and so on, and therefore my knowledge is of that type. Whereas the fishers that I work with, their daily practice is to go out into the sea and actually do the fishing, and their knowledge is based on that type of a practice. So now we agree that different types of knowledges exist, but what is equally important is that these different types of knowledge can often be integrated and can complement each other. And this is what we as shark scientists are really looking to do. So why is studying knowledge useful? As a person interested in conservation, we always think in these really applied ways. And so we may be interested in fishers' knowledge or other people's knowledge because we're trying to understand what conservation measures may work. So as an example, there was this law in Colombia that came into force overnight, and people who were fishing sharks obviously were not involved in creating the policy and therefore felt like they had been turned into criminals overnight. Clearly, this is setting up for a lot of backlash and a lot of issues in the future. And so understanding where people are coming from, what their practices are, what they know about sharks and so on, might have informed a different approach to conservation policy in this case, which might have produced a different reaction from people and therefore would have affected the success of this policy in the long run. We're also interested in what clues we can get from local knowledge that can add to or provide sort of the starting point for further ecological research. And we can get at things like temporal trends and changes in the ecosystem from the knowledge of people who've been in a place for a really long time. But this sort of approach of looking at change can not only address these sort of applied questions that we have, but may also help us to build theory. So something that we as shark scientists or conservationists tend not to do so much is to think about knowledge theoretically. It's also useful for us to think about what knowledge can tell you about the people that you are studying, to understand their social and spiritual relationships, to incorporate new philosophical starting points, because as scientists, we are trained to think from this Western philosophical perspective, and that really limits the way in which we can do science. I mean, if we are interested in increasing objectivity and really applying the scientific method truly, we have to be open to people's different philosophical starting points and thinking about scientific research as starting from there rather than starting only from the kinds of materials that we have been reading until now. We might also find that knowledge shifts and changes. And certainly a useful theoretical concept that Daniel Pauly gave us was the shifting baseline syndrome, where different generations have seen different things in the ocean around them because of either human-induced or other forms of change. This has led to our expectations of what is available in the sea to be completely different across different generations. But it may not just be about generations. Things may vary depending on what type of, say, supply chain a different fisher is plugged into. Someone who finds sharks and rays to be commercially important may have a certain type of knowledge about those species versus someone else who finds them not to be commercially important. And these kinds of things can tell us how different types of people think and may be useful to design studies later on because it can inform us about which types of people are worth talking to about which kinds of research questions. So let's now talk about how we can apply these kinds of philosophies and theories into an actual study. So I'm going to use the example of my work from India, where I wanted to gather fishers' ecological knowledge to kind of conserve sharks and rays in a particular part of India. So my goal was very application oriented. I approached it like a typical conservationist, where I wanted, some clues that can provide for future ecological research. I mean, it would be great if they told me about nursery areas or other things that I could then go out and study from an ecological point of view. I also wanted to fill gaps that scientific research had not been able to address because of, funding constraints or other things. And I wanted to identify conservation approaches that were more effective than existing policies and so on to really effectively conserve sharks and rays. So I did my work on the west coast of India in this area that you can see inside the red oval shape. And the advantage that I had was that I was not only focused on this work on sharks and rays, I was doing this work as part of a larger study on the fishers, their kind of socio-political context, the economics of their fisheries. I was identifying their local practices with respect to fishing. And as a result of having stayed there for quite a significant amount of time, I had some insight into their religion and culture. So all of this told me that I needed to kind of empty my head of some of the Western theories that typically explain fisher behavior. So for instance, this idea of a rational actor making optimal decisions. I didn't see that happening among many of the people there, although I did see it in some. So to just be accepting of that diversity and to understand that these were people who were operating from a particular culture and context, doing this kind of non-shark related work really helped me with that. So this helped me develop particular questions that were related to sharks and rays. I wanted to know where fishers encountered the most threatened species of sharks and rays that I was seeing among the landings. I wanted to know what they knew about different species and to identify the best participatory approach to conserve species in this region, because I found that policy-based approaches were not that effective in this region. To do this, I provided people with a handheld GPS. I also conducted interviews and surveys, and I observed what they were actually doing in different conditions. I, of course, asked questions specifically about the types of shark and ray species that I saw there. There were whale sharks and eagle rays and bamboo sharks and hammerheads and so on. But when I brought up this list of species, the fishers were very confused. There were hammerheads and, say, silky sharks, which had commercial value. But then I was also talking about bamboo sharks and, say, eagle rays, which didn't really have commercial value, and they were more like subsistence level consumption value. And then I was also talking about whale sharks, which everyone knew was protected and therefore could not be fished. And so this sort of random assortment of species, according to them, just did not make sense. So almost everyone kept telling me if I wanted to talk about this group of species, then I needed to talk about all the other species in the environment. I needed to talk about the dolphins and the seahorses and the commercially important fish and the sea turtles and the whales. And they just could not, separate out just the shark species and talk about them. And they kept reiterating to me that the shark species, all the elasmobranchs essentially were dependent on all the other species in the environment. And they could not understand how I could, sort of selectively choose a bunch of species and say, these are the ones that need protection. How are you going to protect them and not think about anything else? So given that they were giving me information in this really complex, interconnected way, the only way that my sort of scientific brain could process this information was in some sort of a graph like this. So when I was asking them where they were encountering different species, they gave me information based on distance from shore, which is what I put on the x-axis, where 0 is to the left and over 50 kilometers away from the shore is on the right. And they were also giving me information in terms of depth, which is on the y-axis, where I'm going from 0 to 40 meters below sea level in the first box, and, anything below that goes into the second box. And so they gave me a list of different species that they were encountering within each of these grids. And they also told me about a lot more species, like all the commercially important species and so on, just out of pure simplistic explanation and my own interest in just the threatened species according to the IUCN Red List. I've only depicted, some symbols of those species here. Now, out of all of these species that they talked about, I was really interested in information that they gave me about bowmouth guitarfish, because I had almost never seen them in the actual catch, and the fishers themselves kind of described them as being very rare at present, although they were more common in the past. And they also told me about dugongs, which are seagrass-eating marine mammals, which I had never heard of from this area. I had also never heard of seagrass in this area, until I went back to centuries-old British records of the area, which talked about someone mentioning seagrass and dugongs from the area. So clearly there was this, random bit of really old knowledge that was still stored in their cultural memories. What I also found was, in terms of asking people how they fished and where they fished, I could map out the areas where they fished. And so now all of the area that is in the blue and red color here are the areas in the sea where people fish. To the right of that is the land. And I sampled 2 districts, Ratnagiri and Sindhudurg. What is marked in yellow is a marine protected area. And the number of species, the number of threatened species encountered is highest in the areas of deepest red and lowest in the areas of deepest blue. So what fishers told me not only about where they encountered species, but also they told me about different practices they had to ensure that they were not overfishing. So they would, for example, not allow fishing in certain areas and have temporary fishing closures in order to ensure that that area would regenerate. They would also, discuss amongst themselves and ensure that a particular area did not have too many fishers in it. So they would kind of divide up the space and ensure that fishing was sort of equitably distributed across the entire space. So these kinds of practices told me that there could be certain modifications of this that they might be open to, in addition to the existing policy level practices of creating a marine protected area and so on. So based on the fishers' ecological knowledge, although I was interested only in these kinds of applied things, I found that what I was getting was some kind of theory of how people thought about the marine environment around them. When I wanted to talk only about sharks and rays, they were giving me information about the entire ecosystem. And this made me realize that if I wanted to talk to them about conservation, I would also have to get into this frame of mind, think about it as a system rather than just as individual species that need to be conserved. In terms of identifying a conservation solution, it seemed clear that based on their systems thinking, individual species bans wouldn't work unless they were species that were very easily identifiable and also very easy to see as they were getting entangled in fishing gear. Now, whale sharks met both of those criteria, and so having a species-based ban for whale sharks would make sense, but it definitely wouldn't make sense for other species. They also brought up the kinds of gaps that we had in knowledge in terms of these species that were no longer being encountered, like the bowmouth guitarfish, and complete species extinctions, like for dugongs. And finally, all of this together told me that if I wanted to approach shark conservation in this region, I would not be able to approach it by talking only about sharks. I would need to talk about the fisheries overall and improving the fisheries overall as a way to then start discussing the conservation of sharks among a list of other species. So overall, what I'd like to leave you with now, as we are thinking about ecological knowledge, forms of knowledge, and how to apply this in our work, we need to understand not only what people think about the species that we are interested in, but we also need to understand how they think about the species that we are interested in and why they think that way. Going through all these different steps is the best way to actually come up with an effective conservation plan that local people will really buy into. So having said this, I just want to say that I'd be happy to have your questions. In case I cannot get to your questions today, please do email me. I have a lot of people to thank for all of this work and also for improving my thinking about knowledge overall. And finally, there are a number of funding institutions and also other institutional support that I've received. And I'd like to thank especially Ashoka University and the Foundation for Ecological Research, Advocacy and Learning for all their support. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Divya. It was amazing, very good information. I definitely agree that considering all the different types of knowledge is essential to have like a good approach for conservation. And it's very important to understand how the community works and how they think to be able to incorporate this knowledge into our research. Thank you very much. It was very interesting. Now I would like to introduce you to our second speaker of the day, Dr. Alifa Haque. She is a marine biologist and ethno-conservationist. She has recently completed her doctoral studies at the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in the Department of Biology of the University of Oxford. Her work focuses in studying the intersection of endangered species conservation and fishermen livelihood in fishery-dependent regions in Bangladesh. And today she will be talking about the value of local ecological knowledge in these data poor regions. Thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alifa Haque. I'm working as the assistant professor in the Department of Zoology, University of Dhaka. I have just defended my thesis in the Department of Biology, University of Oxford, looking at shark fisheries in the Bay of Bengal, especially in Bangladesh. I'd like to thank the organizers of this amazing workshop, very timely one, especially the Human Dimension Working Group of the Shark Specialist Group. It's amazing, the lineup of speakers, and I'm extremely excited. Today, I'm going to talk about how I use local ecological knowledge in my research and pushing the boundaries beyond the perception studies and what we can actually understand in terms of sharks and rays, and what sort of research question can be answered with one example, which I have done very recently. Before going into the local ecological knowledge part, I would like to give a little overview of the coastline that I work in, and also the habitats and fisheries type, because I think the context is extremely important to understand how and why we use local ecological knowledge in a data poor setting. As you can see in the map, this is the coastline of Bangladesh. You can divide it in, well, roughly 3 different regions: the southwestern, south central, and southeastern region. All of these 3 regions are biogeographically quite different from each other, although, of course, with overlapping characteristics. For instance, this is how the southwestern part of Bangladesh would look like, where we have the largest mangrove forest, and because of having this mangrove forest, the habitat is extremely influenced by it, from the rivers, tributaries, and also the coastal waters. A lot of the fresh water comes in, and also, as you can imagine, a lot of the fisheries would thrive in this region as well. The south central region, on the other hand, is a little different. You would be seeing a lot of sandy and muddy little islands, very dynamic in terms of how much fresh water is coming from the upstreams. And because it is so productive and nutrient rich in these areas, the fisheries is quite big. And you can, as you can imagine and see, a lot of the boats are parked very near to the mouth of the river, which falls within the Bay of Bengal. And this is quite different how the southeastern part of Bangladesh would look like, very like a tip of the southeastern part of Bangladesh. It's very oceanic in characteristics. We have an island which is made of rocks, and we have coral patches, seagrasses, all of which you can understand are very good habitats for different types of species of sharks and rays, not only for having them here, but also critical habitats, for example, nursery grounds, pupping grounds, breeding grounds, and many other stuff. As you could imagine, that because we have such interesting habitat types within the coastline, this coastline, and also millions of people who are actually living on the coastlines, you could imagine the fishery would be very big. And such is the case in Bangladesh. The artisanal fisheries, as you can see in the photos, with small to medium-sized boats, wooden built, we have more than 70,000 boats which are going out to the sea for catching different types of target species, and any type of gear would catch sharks and rays as a bycatch. However, we can't really call them a bycatch because they're extremely desirable, so they can be a secondary catch or a very desirable, non-discarded catch, as if you're going to call them. Now, different types of gears are being used for different types of species that are being targeted, starting from setback nets, gill nets, long lines, seine nets, bottom set nets, and it's depending on the season and depending on what sort of boat and target species you have, you would be using different types of gears, and sometimes interchangeable gears depending on what season you are working on. Apart from that, we also have target ray fishery in Bangladesh, which is a long line with thousands of hooks attached to each line, which can be from 5 to 10 kilometers long. And within one kilometer of line, you could have 10 to 30,000 hooks, which are unbaited. So you wouldn't use any bait, and the hooks would go down to the bottom layer and would catch anything that has a flat body, because the hooks would be entangled within the body of the rays. And we have quite a few hundred boats that would be targeting rays in a certain season of the year. And of course, we have subsistence fisheries, which fishers would go every day, would come back with a small number of catch. Through this huge diversified gears that are being used in Bangladesh and the number of boats, the catch of sharks and rays is really high, especially in the winter season. As you can see in these photos, we have more than 90 species that has been recorded in the past 4 years, and that we have seen that are frequently, some of which are frequently being caught within these fisheries, and a huge number of fishers who would depend on the secondary catches as well. Of course, we also have many critically endangered species, such as the kitafishes, sawfishes, hammerheads, and an existing trade which drives some of these catches or a market that is thriving within these fisheries, which would help this business to thrive. Now, the most interesting bit is we did a few socio-ecological studies, depending on local ecological knowledge, not only answering how the trade looks like, how the fishery looks like, what sort of fisheries is catching more species, or even what sort of incentives fishers would need to adhere to regulations. So we did a lot of perception studies and created a baseline to understand what's happening in terms of shark catch, trade, and fisheries, and a lot of socio-ecological aspects in the last 4 years. But I really wanted to push the boundaries and try to understand how do we really understand these actions and these aspects of fisheries in a spatially explicit manner in the face of extreme data poor, in the face of data poor and all being data poor, and also answering critical questions like how would we do spatial management, especially after when we have adopted 30 by 30 goal globally. So for spatial management, we would be needing spatially explicit areas identified, either where these fisheries are being aggregated or where these species are interacting with these fisheries. But as you would know, in terms of a lot of resource poorness in this region, going out in the sea and doing this research takes a huge amount of money, which in many cases we do not have at our disposal. In that manner, as we have worked with these communities for about 7 years now, we had built a certain sort of a trust, and we had the experience of knowing that how in depth these fishers understand these areas and these fisheries techniques. So we thought, how about we kind of think each fishing boat as one data point and try to understand where they fish from social ecological knowledge, and can we really map in a spatially explicit manner where these fisheries are aggregating in a 3-dimensional space, not only in the horizontal space, but also in terms of depth. And can we really identify those spaces in terms of what sort of species are being interacted in those spaces, and where are these areas aggregated actions are happening for a better spatial management in collaboration with these fishing communities. From this very overall goal, we started talking to the fishers and tried to understand where they fish. So we conducted about 1,158 interviews in the span of 2 years throughout the coast of Bangladesh, and then ran about 31 workshops with the fishers, trying to understand these spaces through a participatory mapping exercise. The most interesting bit is that in participatory mapping, we really had to spend a lot of time understanding how these fishers understand mapping. It's not exactly how we understand maps. So we had to spend a lot of time understanding what are those landmarks that these fishers understand and identify. What is the exact unit of distance that they use? Is it kilometers? Is it nautical miles? Is it are different types of unit that they use? Do they understand travel time, or do they understand directions? What is this exactly that they use in their minds and through their experiences to go to these spaces to fish? So we did a lot of qualitative understanding that how to design this research so that we can spatially design these maps, where they fish. So we had to understand how they understand map. We had to understand the language, how they understand distance, depth, and what sort of unit they use. And then we had to build a lot of trust, understanding if they're happy to share all those knowledges with us. and it took us a long time. These are the areas where we conducted our interviews and also our workshops. Now came the point that what did we find through this exercise? So what we did was we did individual interviews asking very simple questions like where you start your fishing from, can you identify that area? And then how long do you go? Do you go in the similar direction or do you go in different directions? Which direction do you go for how many hours? What is the speed of the boat? How long can they go by that hour that they have mentioned? And then we have pointed out those points within a grid map, which we used in collaboration with which we designed in collaboration with the fishers, with the landmarks in blue that you can see here. And then that was one exercise and pointing out in a 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer grid within the map that where they fish. And then we actually gave them the map that could you really then identify where you exactly fish? And by doing so, we have mapped 7 different fisheries types within the coastline of Bangladesh. And it was extremely important to understand these areas gear-wise because different gears, of course, has different catchability of sharks and rays, and of course have different target species and thus would have different impact in terms of catch of these species. And as you can see, in 7 different types of fisheries were mapped. Now the question really came, well, we mapped the fisheries and how do we use these maps for better management, for better information, better informing the policymakers? And then also comes the question, well, wouldn't there be still some biases because we're only using socio-ecological data? How can we really decrease the biases and uncertainties? So we actually went down and using a very simple open access app, tracked a few boats for 51 different trips within these areas. And we have taken unbaited longline boats as our case study. So we have mapped these areas. We have given this app and a phone to these fishers as an incentive to use this app. And then using the same phone, they have taken photos with GPS locations of where this species has been caught and taken, as you can see in the photos, very good photos where are very easily identifiable in terms of species, and also mapped where exactly they have gone to fish. In doing so, we have identified these areas where this certain fishery goes out to fish. And of course, along with that, a lot of interesting data in terms of a very spatially explicit manner. And then we made the heat maps to see, are these aggregations of fishing areas same what we have done in our socio-ecological knowledge exercise? And they were quite similar. As you can see in these maps, that is just one boat using one certain gear. And we have found the areas where they mostly aggregate and stop to catch the species or the target species. And we have actually used it to compare it with the maps that we have made before. And they're quite similar, even in identifying the aggregation point, not only just what areas that they go out for fishing. So the exercise was extremely important for us and also gave us some very interesting ideas in terms of spatially explicit fishing footprint identification in a 3-dimensional space. Now, what can we do with these maps? I'm just going to give you one example that we have identified where was the sawfish being caught in the last 30 years, and we have made heat maps with those maps, right? And now we know where these fisheries are active, and then we used these fishing maps, imposing them with the areas where a critically endangered species like a sawfish being caught, and kind of identified where these more areas are more exposure. The species is mostly exposed to different kinds of fisheries. Now, as I have earlier said, the different type of fisheries has different types of catchability. So this would give us an idea about where these species are most at risk to what fisheries in a spatially explicit manner, so that we can do some area-based management with better understanding, better nuances, and hopefully with better effectiveness. Thank you very much. I'd love to answer more questions in terms of the socio-ecological knowledge that we have used of fishers to answer such questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Alifa. It was amazing. You mentioned many interesting points, but I would like to highlight when you were talking about the participatory mapping, that you invested a lot of time trying to understand how the local community, the fishing community, understands the mapping and how they do it, to be able to incorporate their knowledge into your research. And this is completely connected to one of the points that Divya was mentioning on her previous talk, saying how important it is to understand the community and how they work to gather this knowledge. So very interesting. Thank you very much, and very nice results also in the fishing aggregation areas. I would like to remind to all the participants of the workshop to please write all your questions in the chat for our speakers. We will bring these questions up after the last presentation. We will have a Q&A session for these questions, so please write them in the chat. Then finally, I would like to introduce to our third and last speaker of the day, Trisha Gupta. She is a marine conservation scientist, which is currently pursuing her PhD at the University of Oxford. Her research focuses on the fisheries and conservation of sharks and rays in India by using interdisciplinary approaches for this aim. Today, she will be talking about her study on rhino rays in the coast of Goa in India. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, I'm Trisha Gupta, a PhD student at the University of Oxford. My research focuses on the fisheries and conservation of sharks and rays in India. Thank you so much to Divya and the other organizers for inviting me here to give this talk, as I'm always excited to share my research. So my talk today will focus on a study where we used and drew on local ecological knowledge for the conservation of rhino rays in India. So as most of us know, rhino rays are the most threatened species groups even within elasmobranchs, and are at risk of extinction. So when I say rhino rays, for this talk, I specifically mean the giant guitarfish, wedgefish and sawfish families. These three families, because of their life history characteristics, the high demand for fins and other socioeconomic drivers, have been pushed to the edge of extinction due to overfishing, and most species are unfortunately recently assessed as critically endangered. So my work focuses a bit more on the giant guitarfish family, as these are the species that are more common around my study region. When it comes to the distribution of giant guitarfish, as you can see from this map, these species are commonly distributed across the tropics and subtropics of the Indo-Pacific. And as you can also see, there is a quite high species richness around the Indian subcontinent. So India does have a high number of giant guitarfish species, and we're also one of the top shark and ray fishing nations in the world. This basically means that our landings of sharks and rays in the country are amongst the highest. But despite having this high species richness of rhino rays and these high landings, we know very little about these species from our waters. For the longest time, these species were quite overlooked when it came to research efforts, and we knew very little about their ecology, their socioeconomic uses, fisheries, and other related aspects. Over the last 5 years, there have been some efforts directed towards these species and some really good research that has been published on rhino rays, but there's still a lot we don't know about these species, and they remain very poorly managed when it comes to their fisheries. I also apologize if you hear any background noise because there's a lot of construction happening around my house at the moment. So I hope that I remain audible all throughout the presentation. As I was saying, yeah, rhino rays are very poorly studied. And in this context, local ecological knowledge can be a very valuable source of information to address a lot of these knowledge gaps when it comes to threatened species such as rhino rays. And I'm sure the other speakers have spoken a lot about LEK and its uses, so I won't spend too much time here. My study site for this research is Goa, which is a coastal state on the west coast of India, and it's known both for its fisheries as well as tourism. Why I chose Goa as a study site and what drew me to this region is that there are a number of beaches where rhino rays are known to come very close to shore, to the very shallow waters by the shoreline. So I have a little video here also that shows you just how shallow waters these species can be found in. This is a wide-nosed guitarfish, a subadult, I think, and as you can see, it's found inhabiting very shallow waters indeed. So we suspect that these habitats might be serving as nursery grounds for this species and other rhino rays in the region. But of course, this needs further study to confirm this. Unfortunately, because of their proximity to the shore, these habitats are currently being threatened not just by coastal fisheries, but also by tourism and other activities that are occurring in this region. So the objectives of our study were to look at the ecology of these species, particularly their habitat use and seasonality, their interaction with fisheries and their socioeconomic values, as well as we look to explore the attitudes of local communities towards their conservation. And as I mentioned earlier, this all of these objectives were addressed through local ecological knowledge. So we first conducted semi-structured interviews with fishers all across the coastline of Goa. This included small-scale fishers such as gill netters and shore scene fishers, as well as trawl and purse seine fishers. So we conducted 66 of such interviews in total. Fishers were approached and selected through convenience and snowball sampling. So this was conducted by my colleague Andrew, who visited various landing centers and harbors across the coastline and approached fishers who were relatively free or available and asked for an interview. It's important to note that a lot of the interviews we conducted turned out to be group interviews, and this is something I'm sure many in the audience have also experienced, where it is challenging to interview just individuals alone. Fishers do tend to be found in groups along with their family or crew members or friends, and even if you do get a solo interview, that process tends to attract other fishers in the region and they come and join and form a group. So we ended up conducting group interviews instead of individual, and I'll speak a bit more about this later. Following the semi-structured interviews, a few months later, we then conducted key informant interviews. Now, key informants in this case refer to fishing community leaders, union leaders, and other experienced elders who were recommended by several others to be very knowledgeable about various fishery related things. So we conducted 22 of these interviews in total. And of course, these interviewees were approached through purposive sampling because we intentionally sought out specific individuals to interview. Now, the purpose of these key informant interviews was two reasons. First thing is that we wanted to validate and triangulate the LEK information that we had gained through the previous semi-structured interviews. And the second reason is that we explored the conservation aspects of our study through these interviews. So we explored the perceptions and attitudes of local communities towards the conservation of rhino rays and discussed this with them. So these interviews tended to be longer, between 30 to 60 minutes, and were largely qualitative. So how was our data analyzed? As I mentioned, a lot of it was qualitative, and this was mostly analyzed on NVivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software. So we coded for, we used different methods of coding, where we first also coded for themes and topics that we had decided on beforehand related to LEK and other aspects of the study. But we also coded for any unexpected or emergent themes that we had not thought of before, but had emerged from the interview transcripts. Once we had our LEK statements ready, we compared this information to conventional scientific literature to see how these two data sources compare and contrast. And finally, we also looked into something called relational values. Relational values refer to the different types of values and relationships that local communities may hold for species such as rhino rays, beyond just the economic and monetary values that these species hold. So this was not something that we had decided to do beforehand, but something that we included in our study after seeing the different types of relationships and stories that fishers had mentioned throughout the interviews. So I'll briefly go over what we found. When it comes to the habitat use, fishers agreed that rhino rays were found most fishers said that rhino rays were found mostly in sandy habitats near rocks. And they also mentioned specific river mouths and estuaries where these species were found in Goa. And through this, we were able to create a map at a broad resolution of the habitat use of these species. When it comes to their seasonality, Fisher said that the months towards the end and just after the rains, so August, September, October, were the season for guitarfish or rhino rays. These were the months where these species were seen the most in the water, and also the months where fishers would catch them the most in their nets. So these would be the months to target for any kind of conservation interventions. So finally, as I mentioned, we compared this with information from conventional scientific literature, and this yielded some interesting results. For example, a number of fishers mentioned ontogenetic shifts in rhino rays, where juveniles and pups occupy the nearshore waters and move offshore as they became adults. And this is something that has been found in scientific literature and mentioned for a lot of species in various different references. On the other hand, fishers also gave us information on breeding of rhino rays, suggesting that their breeding takes place during or just after the raids. This is not something that we found in literature because in general there's very little information about the breeding of rhino ray species from Indian waters, but it is consistent with the literature for other rhino ray species found in different regions. So this definitely adds some new information to the database for rhino rays. And finally, we also came across some very interesting observations, as several fishers mentioned that they saw rhino rays come to the water surface to breathe or take a big gulp of air. Now, this is not quite aligned with scientific literature, and nor is it aligned with the biological characteristics of these species, but it still needs further investigation to really understand what fishers meant by these observations, and also better look into the behavior of these species. Coming to their fisheries, all fishers stated that rhino rays were entirely caught as bycatch and were not targeted in any way. And gill nets were also found to catch the highest numbers of rhino rays, even higher than trawl nets, shore scenes, or purseines. After capture, rhino rays were either sold in the market, taken home for consumption, or even discarded back into the water, dead or alive. And its post-capture use depended largely on the size of the rhino rays. So larger individuals, of course, were sold in the market, whereas smaller individuals were generally discarded. And it also depended on location because we found different trends across the North and South Goa. But on the whole, it was clear that rhino rays had a very low economic value. Even when sold in the market, they were not sold for very large amounts of money. And we also found no evidence for fin trade. It appeared that these species were entirely used for consumption only. So coming to the relational values, we did code a number of different relational values that were expressed through interviews about rhino rays. For example, a number of fishermen mentioned how rhino rays were particularly enjoyed along with the drink after a hard day's work. They enjoyed consuming it, and this was then coded as a recreational value. Other fishers would talk about various childhood experiences and non-fishing experiences with these species, spotting them in the water and so on. And a few even mentioned how seeing a rhino ray was lucky because they were hard to spot in the water. So if you saw one, it was considered to be good luck. So these were just a few, and we did code a number of other relational values for rhino rays as well. And it was interesting to see how these different values were expressed for a species that was, in the end of the day, just a low value bycatch species in this region, and yet people had these different relationships and cultural associations with them. Finally, the last part of our study looked at their conservation, and if you remember, this was done entirely only through the key informant interviews. So very positively, all key informants that we interviewed actually expressed positive attitudes towards rhino ray conservation, where they stated that since they're really not caught in large numbers and they're not sold for very large amounts of money, if rhino rays were to be protected and not allowed to be caught anymore, it wouldn't really impact the fishermen much, and they would be willing to follow these measures. They suggested that live release of these species back into the water might be the best option because it would be hard to avoid catching them. So in contrast, when we would ask them a similar question about sharks, we found a different story where most fishers, or majority of the fishers, were against the idea of any kind of shark conservation measures because sharks were high value. They were sought out and targeted by many fishers in this region, and any kind of protection and ban on sharks would have an impact on fisher livelihoods. Finally, we also asked key informants about whether any kind of monetary compensation would be needed if rhino rays were to be protected and released back into the water. And surprisingly, majority of the fishers said that no compensation would be needed, that they would be happy to just release them back in the water without any incentive, though some did ask for any kind of compensation. So to quickly conclude, I hope our study has demonstrated the importance and usefulness of local ecological knowledge, because not only did LEK help fill the important gaps in knowledge when it comes to rhino ray ecology, but it also helped understand how these species are used and perceived within the local socio-economic context. And furthermore, it helped us identify the sites, seasons, and gear that needed to be targeted for conservation interventions for these species. So it's very important that this LEK is brought into the scientific mainstream and actually used in decision making. So for the Goa context, it was clear that rhino rays were entirely bycatch, had very low economic values, and fishers also had positive attitudes towards their conservation. So this shows that there is a high potential to implement some sort of conservation action for these species in this region, especially live release measures. And this is something that can be designed in the near future with participation of the community. This is something that we're hoping to also do as a follow-up to the study. So we did get a lot of questions sent to us beforehand, asking more about the process of gathering LEK and working with LEK and conducting these types of interviews. So I thought I would quickly go over the things that worked well for us in our study and that I can offer as tips and suggestions to anyone else doing similar kind of work. So I think, yeah, this might seem like an obvious one, but it's important to interview fishers at a time and location that's convenient to them rather than what's convenient to us researchers. And this might mean making multiple trips back to the same location in order to find that right time. And as I mentioned, when fishers were sorting their catch or cleaning their nets, those tended to be good times to approach them for these interviews. So this is really important. Taking informed consent from fishers before conducting interviews is not only needed ethically, but it also helps build trust with fishers and gets them to be comfortable speaking to you. If you tell them from the start what your intentions are very clearly, what the purpose of this research is, what you require from them, and how this data will be used, they tend to then be less suspicious of the researcher and more willing to answer questions. Whereas in cases where we didn't make our intentions very clear, they tended to definitely be a lot more suspicious, and rightfully so. This is a very simple point, but something that worked really well for us is that we had printed good quality color pictures of the different rhino ray species found in this region, and we laminated these so that they wouldn't get damaged and could be reused. And these photos were passed around with the fishers right at the start of the interviews, especially in group interviews. And we found that this really helped engage fishers, get them to get interested in our research and start talking to us, because fishers would like to look at the pictures, try and identify them. They would discuss amongst themselves what the different species might be, and would even start telling us stories about these species without us having to ask questions or prompting. So these photographs really helped. And in relation to that, another thing that worked for us was to start with easy questions. So initially we were actually starting our interviews asking about the background information and demographics such as age, years of experience, gear type, and so on, about these fishers, but that didn't work as well. But instead, when we started asking them simple questions about rhino rays, they would be a lot more engaged. Things like the names of these species in the local language would definitely get the fishers more excited and willing to talk to you. And finally, as I mentioned, we had to conduct group interviews, and I think this actually worked well for us because this way we ended up talking to a lot more people than just the 66 interviews that we conducted, and got a lot more perspectives and knowledge in, and I think this really enriched our information. Of course, it's not just that everything went well. There were a lot of challenges and things that did not go as well, or things that I would do differently if I was doing a similar study in the future. For example, neither myself nor my colleague who did the study have any formal training in social sciences, and I think it's important to at least get some form of training or lots of reading into social science theories and methods and techniques, because that would really strengthen our entire fieldwork and methods process. Unfortunately, we were not able to include fisherwomen in our study because our study almost entirely focused on the men, which is definitely an oversight because the women of the community hold a very rich and different set of knowledge of the species around them, and in future, for any kind of future study, I would definitely include them in the study as well. We were not able to collect species level data as fishers found it difficult to identify the different species from the photos that we showed them. So we had to collect data at the group level. And I think in the future it would be good to invest some time in trying to understand how fishers perceive these different species and what are the ways that they use to distinguish between them. Maybe looking into the local names and things like that, which would then help get the species level data. As I said, certain things like the relational values was something that we decided to do post hoc, and it's always good to actually have these analysis plans ready before you start your fieldwork, because if had we thought about doing relational values initially, we could have included relevant questions in our questionnaire and strengthened our study through this. And finally, although we did compare our LEK that we gathered with conventional science, there are some really good frameworks out there that help integrate these different data sets and knowledge sets to form something that can be very useful for decision making. And this is something that I would like to do for the future. So that's it for me. I hope that this was helpful and useful. Thank you once again to the organizers for inviting me here. And thank you as well to my funders, supervisors, my research team, and of course the fishing communities of Goa. I put my contact details here in case anybody wants to reach out. I'm happy to talk, and of course happy to answer any questions during the Q&A session coming up. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Trisha. It was absolutely great and amazing. Very, very interesting case study on how to apply local ecological knowledge and showing that it's actually useful to obtain this scientific data. I found super interesting to see how some of the things that the fishermen were saying were in accordance with the literature and some others weren't. So that was super interesting to see. Now, I think we're going to start to discuss the results of the polls that we have been putting in the chat through this day. So maybe all the speakers can join me for this, and we can discuss the polls and the results of these ones. Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think our first poll was sort of looking at what local ecological knowledge is. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. And it seems quite that the majority of people felt that it was knowledge and beliefs of local communities regarding ecological relationships. And as I said, I think a lot of people are sort of confused about these terms because often we are talking about the hybrid knowledge that sort of sits between the exact definitions of many of these terms. And perhaps it's okay that we're sort of coining new terms like Fisher's ecological knowledge and so on to define these new hybrid knowledges. Alifa, do you have anything to add?
No, I totally agree. Actually, it's even while working, it was very difficult to differentiate. I think it would totally depend on how you frame your question and what sort of research questions you are asking and answering. Sometimes even cultural belief systems have species and species knowledge very deeply embedded into that belief system. So in many cases, I couldn't really differentiate many of the ecological understanding about the species coming from fishing communities were different from their cultural practices. It's really as knowledge is, and Divya, you would understand better that knowledge itself is so complicated. In many cases, I kind of felt that all three of these couldn't have been differentiated. But yeah, for the purpose of answering a specific question, you can define it in terms of what you need to answer.
Trisha, do you want to add something?
Hi, Divya. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry, my internet is crashed in the middle, so I'm not sure what the discussion is on.
Okay. So we were discussing the results of the first poll, which is up here on the screen. What do you think LEK is?
Okay. Yeah, I feel like, to be honest, if I hadn't read some of the recent papers on the different definitions of these things, I would also be a bit confused. And I think in general, there does seem to be a lot of uncertainty about these things. And as you mentioned in your talk, Divya, for us shark researchers, we often use the terms interchangeably because what we're interested in is something hybrid, but there might be a need for, I think, a better clarification of these things, even within the shark sciences, so that we can better use these different types of tools.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we often tend not to do or tend to overlook is that there are social scientists who are deeply qualified to talk about knowledge and all these terms. And especially when we are going to do research like this, it would be great to collaborate with someone who is really qualified in those disciplines so that we can, appropriately study something rather than sort of just do something for the sake of our application value. Okay, shall we move on to the next one, which is who can be involved in LEK in shark conservation? I think the majority of people clearly said everyone in the local community, and I would totally agree with that. because people have different types of knowledge. It may not only be through direct interactions, and there may be different things that we are interested in as well. Just getting the perspectives of people even further down the supply chain may be quite interesting and may have some connection to the ecology of species.
Yeah, I think also talking to all the local community will help to understand better the background and how the community works. It will help, obviously, to understand the fishermen and all the steps on the community for this knowledge. So I completely agree with that too.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add that when we talk about conservation, it is sometimes such a broad spectrum of understanding that we need. It's not only just ecology or the species or the maps or where the species is. It's also deeply rooted in the value system of many people, how they see it. So when it comes down to shark conservation as a term altogether, it's extremely important not only to try and understand the local communities in terms of fishers or the consumers or indirectly people who are depending on these fisheries, but also people with power who have some sort of a power to take decisions of making all those policies, enforcement, have the resources to design incentives for the longer term, and political willingness for adding it to the greater agenda of the country. So whenever we are talking about shark conservation, although mostly we work with fishers and communities, I think a big lacking and limitation still there, that the value system of all these stakeholders needs to be understood and integrated. So it's extremely important to, as Paula and Divya and Trisha made sure, that it's extremely important to understand all those knowledges, values, and also how they relate to this particular species group. And that's how, at the end of the day, shark conservation might be possible. So, yeah.
Would you like to add anything, Trisha?
Yeah, sorry, my internet just dropped off again.
Yeah, it might have. I think it's not working for me either. So now.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
I can now, yes.
Yeah, okay, I'm just actually got to my field site today, so obviously the internet is not the best. I
think she may have dropped off again.
Yeah, maybe we can. I'm sorry, Trisha, but we cannot hear you.
Yeah, sorry, let's just move on and hopefully I can join in again later.
Yeah, if not, maybe, yeah, sure. We can address it later or during the last day in the breakout groups too. So going to the third question of the poll, which was, where do you think that the LEK studies in shark conservation are more common as a knowledge source? Most of the people voted in developing countries or low-income countries, although it was very, very similar to the remote communities. So I don't know if you have an opinion about this.
Yeah, I think this is sort of a common misconception that local ecological knowledge is sort of some romantic thing that people who live in cultures that are very connected to the natural environment tend to have more of it. But having said that, I definitely know of anthropologists in the global north who are studying how fishers have developed a new kind of local ecological knowledge using things like fish finders and sonar and things like that, and how they use these new images coming out from new technologies to identify species based on their other knowledge of those species and how they might show up on these new technologies. So it's not as if ecological knowledge is something that exists in some romantic and remote primitive past of us, but it's something that is continually developing as we develop new technologies.
I totally agree with Divya, and while I was reading the question, I kind of felt the same, that we have somehow decoupled local ecological knowledge from the mainstream of knowledge base and kind of put it in a box somewhere, what some people do. And I also kind of feel like it's a missed opportunity, and I have learned it through the process of my own work. So I too started looking at local ecological knowledge because it felt like that there is nothing in terms of knowledge base in this region, and where do I start? And talking to the communities and understanding these knowledges and mainstreaming the local ecological knowledge into answering questions seemed like the first thing that I could do, given the resources I had, given the question I was really interested in. But while doing it, I kind of understood that it was a good thing that it happened to me, because the mindset that I can only do local ecological knowledge because I do not have enough resources to do something else is a missed opportunity in terms of creating this knowledge base, which are going to be lost with generations, and which are extremely important even for a management plan or a management to be successful. So while doing local ecological knowledge, it's not a very unilateral information sharing. It's a bilateral relationship that you are creating with these communities who now know your face, who now know what you do, and have some kind of a trust and trusted in you, and also have an expectations of something that you can give back, which is another big black box we can talk about. But while doing these things, you are actually creating a certain sort of a baseline, not only in terms of information, but in terms of a very interesting, I don't know how to put it in language, interesting give and take kind of a relationship, where a lot of the other future work can be based upon. So to try to understand local ecological knowledge and kind of relate it to low income and developing countries would be a big missed opportunity, even for a very resourceful country to be able to, to plan to do some big management. They do have to go to the local communities for that particular management action to be successful. So yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. It's something that I kind of was talking to Divya and the group other day as well, that starting your research with a little bit of qualitative understanding is the best way that can happen to the research. So.
Thank you very much. I completely agree with absolutely everything you said. Maybe now, since we finished with the polls, we can move to some of the questions that we found in the chat. Thank you very much for asking these questions. So we have a question from Marta Cambra for you, Alifa. She usually finds very, very difficult to get information about where do fishermen go to fish. So she would like to know if there's anything you offer in exchange for this information, or how you can make sure that they are giving you real information that can be useful for your study.
Thank you, Marta, for asking this question. It's a very important question and something that we deal with every day. Anybody who's working with fishing communities do have this idea and sort of a fear that how much uncertainty is this data bringing to my data set, and how much I can trust into the data. Now, I'll try to answer it from a very personal perspective, and then from a very scientific perspective, that how to decrease the uncertainties of a data set, especially while we are talking about socio-ecological data or local ecological knowledge. From my personal view and from my experience of working with these fishing communities in the last few years, what I've understood is that there is no reason why someone would just lie to you unless there is something something underlying, there is an issue underlying of distrust. So for example, where I work with, I started working there in 2016, 17. And back then I didn't have a research question, but I used to go and just mix with the communities, sit in a tea stall and have tea with these people, just have conversation, trying to understand what's going on. Now, I'm not saying that this is the only way to go about it, but that kind of gave me the leverage to be really on the same page with these people, without much to ask, or without much intrusion in terms of a lot of questions that I'm going to ask. While this sort of a trust and kind of a relationship is built and your face is known to these people and you're someone who just go there, collect the information and gone forever, you're not someone like that, and you come back again and again and again, there is a certain sort of a trust built, and you would find that the conversations itself reveals that there are real concerns, there are real information, there are real knowledge that are being shared. So time and trust, there is no no alternative to this for doing a research where you're asking some sensitive questions or questions which a community might not be happy to share with. Now, why would a community wouldn't share an information with a certain person is a question that we also need to ask. In my experience, in 2021, Bangladesh came up with the law of protecting most of the sharks and rays, and the law came in, as Divya was talking about Colombia, overnight, and there weren't a lot of awareness, there were not a lot of consultation, there were not a lot of meaningful collaboration whereby these people had a say in the making of the law, and also kind of designing what would mean, what can they do, what can't they do. That kind of criminalized a community of thousands of people. And then the enforcement came in very quickly as well, without giving them a lot of lag face. Now, when then in 2021 onwards, we started talking to the fishers, of course, they felt a certain sort of a distrust. Of course, they felt that this sort of information is kind of bringing in these regulations, which are hampering their livelihoods. They're the cost payers of any management. Now, we need to understand the context of the community we are creating this relationship with, why and why not they are going to share this information with you, and how can you make sure that you are a person they are happy to and they're trusting enough to share this information with. So that's kind of a long-term plan of doing such a research, and that's difficult, but I think that's what we need to invest a lot of time if we have that within our research project. Now, from a very scientific perspective, of course, socio-ecological data brings in biases because it's people's perception, and people see the world differently. They measure the world differently. If you ask someone that have this particular species has gone down, or what is the population do you think? Now, for some people, 100 is, 100 specimen probably is a very limited number. For some, 100 is a lot. So of course there is biases, and depending on what sort of questions you're asking, you need to frame that in a way that you could find the pattern and answer your research question. In terms of where the fishers go to fish, we had validation workshops. So for example, we did all the individual questionnaires, the grid mapping, participatory mapping. We mapped them and then took those maps to the same fishing communities with elder fishers, with captains of the boats, and we run workshops to see if the maps that we are made in terms of three-dimensional spaces, the depth and the horizontal breadth, are these correct? Do they feel that we have mapped the right things, or do they think that we have probably overmapped or undermapped a certain thing? So using those techniques of validations and assessments, you can decrease your biases and uncertainties of the data that you get. And also, while you interview fishers about fishing locations that they go, if you kind of use different methods, so for example, individual interviews, workshops, and then what points you're going to take and what points you're not going to take, there can be a protocol set, which we did for our research, that which are the points we're going to take for this mapping and which are the points are probably really biased and we are not going to take in the mapping. So we could kind of plan it before analyzing the data, kind of to decrease the uncertainties. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much for your answer, Alifa. Very well thought and prepared. Thank you very much. We have another question now for Trisha. Let's see if hopefully your internet is working now and you can answer this one. So this is a question from Avik. They're asking, how do you do it in group interviews if you have felt or encountered situations where the people are influencing each other on their perspectives and on their opinions? And if this happens, like, how do you get this diverse set of inputs on your data?
Hi, Paula, and hi, everyone. I hope the internet stays stable. This is a really good question, and it's definitely an issue that we've faced, and I'm sure maybe others have faced in similar studies as well. And that is a downside of group interviews, that people do tend to influence each other. So for this particular study, we would generally let the fishers discuss amongst themselves, and they would generally reach a bit of a consensus. Suppose we would ask them, for example, what season are rhino rays breeding in. So maybe one person may think about it and say, I think they might breed in June, but then another older fisherman would maybe counter that, and then they may discuss between themselves and say, actually, we think that they breed in August. And of course, in this case, the older fisherman does have that power to sway the younger fisherman, and here we are assuming that maybe his knowledge is better in this case. But it's really hard to tell. And I think in cases like this, we would try to note down some of the contrasting responses we get as well, because I think the good thing about LEK is that we are looking for these diverse responses. We're not looking for that one quantitative answer. So I think we sort of added to the knowledge base, and in cases like this, sometimes this would count as a separate response in our data, and it would so then we, in the end, when we were analyzing our data, we would count the number of responses that would say June as the breeding months, the number of responses that suggested August, and so on. So we would try
Did it cut for everyone, I assume? Yeah. Okay, then maybe we can move on and let her finish a little bit. Are you back, Trisha?
Hello, yeah, I think I did drop. Yeah, I don't know at what point I got lost.
I'm not sure either. It's probably stopped differently for everyone.
For me, it stopped when... Yeah. Is it Trisha?
Go for it, Alifa.
Oh, for me, it stopped when you were talking about that we're going to count different responses to the same question, and you were describing something along the line.
Yeah, maybe we can move on, because I don't think it's working for her anymore. Okay, so now we can go with a question from Hakan Kavasakal for Divya. He explains how LEK seems a very efficient tool to identify the overlapping location of the seasonal aggregations of elasmobranchian fishermen. So he would like to know how we can size of the prejudiced fishermen that do not seek such aggregations. So, like, for example, people that it's not aware of these seasonal aggregations, do we consider as false abundance, or how do you deal with this situation?
Oh, okay.
Now,
I was wondering where this question was. Okay. How do you make sure that the fishermen don't start looking for these aggregations once this knowledge is out there? I think that's how I understood the question. But I think all of this goes back to this idea of building trust and relationships with the community that Alifa was talking about. Certainly, I don't think that there is a way once people know about something for us to kind of go and police them, because after all, we have no authority to do that. But in many of the communities that I have worked with, seeing as they are sort of on the front lines of what is happening to the ecosystem, what is happening to their fish catches, and especially if they are in a position of at least having some control or economic capacity. So, for instance, if they own their own boats and have the capacity to decide where to go fishing and so on, they tend to also be concerned about what's happening to the environment. And so, once they are made aware that these are, breeding aggregations, which if they fish, they're basically going to run out of them in the future, I think that is an argument that they themselves can understand and often do understand. So, for instance, I have encountered fishers who have kind of set aside these areas for themselves. They do dip into it on emergency situations, but they have, made these like temporary closures and so on for themselves, because they do understand that if they fish everything out right now, they will have nothing in the future. And the economic situation, at least in places like India, is such that fishing still offers a sort of viable income as compared to many other potential occupations or alternative sources of employment for people who have the kinds of qualifications that they do. So often for them, access to other alternatives is not great, particularly the kinds of alternatives they have don't really provide a good living. And so fishing is their main source of income. And so given that, they do want to ensure that their fisheries continue in the long run. And so it would make sense for them to participate in some kind of management. So I don't think that, first of all, I'm sure that the fishers themselves already know about these things. It's not like we are presenting them with the information. And secondly, I'm pretty sure that they will understand the need to fish sustainably, given that they are invested in fishing in the long term.
Thank you very much for your answer, Divya. I think we might have time for one last question. This is from Patricia, and it's for everyone. So feel free to join if you want to answer. She wonders that they have many students that want to start using Eliki on their research. So she would like to know your opinion, like which ones are the main challenges that they were going to focus, like they were going to face, and how to overcome to these challenges, if you have any suggestions for them.
Alifa, would you like to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's amazing, and it's very good that people are getting more interested in being involved in Eliki studies. That only makes the team bigger, so I'm really happy. But that's also, well, I mean, it's very difficult to answer this question. The challenges are going to be different in terms of the context and in terms of where you are, and sometimes who you are. I'm going to talk about a few. There are going to be different and many more challenges while you kind of go through the journey yourself, and you would see that the challenges are going to be very different. But overall, as I said, that in many cases, when we write a project, be that a PhD project or a master's project or even a conservation project, time is the essence, right? We have goals to fulfill, we have box to tick, we have deadlines to fulfill, and also to publish a data before it's too old. That kind of takes away the most important bit, is that preparing for that particular study. So I think preparation and design is half the work done for an Eliki study than the Eliki itself. So in preparation, the challenges are going to be, for example, first, you wouldn't probably have a lot of time to build all those relationships if you're looking at only just one study. So One way to go about it would be then collaborate with people who have access to these communities, or talk to community leaders who already have a trusted bond with the community members and can assist you through this, as opposed to just going out there and asking questions without exercising and building that trust and taking the time. The next bit is that, and I really want to touch upon it a little bit, and we haven't talked about it at all, is that being a woman and doing Iliki studies has its own challenges, especially if you're working in this part of the world, in the global south. So there would be issues with safety. There would be issues with a lot of societal things, and your capacity is going to be questioned sometimes. And also, systematically, probably there aren't enough help established for a woman to go out for long hours in the field. And that starts from living in a boat, going there without any safety issues and stuff like that. And so what it's need to be done to then overcome this sort of a challenge is that have something planned within your project which safeguards the research assistant, the researchers who are going out to the field to work with these communities in transports, in the area, and making sure the safety nets are there, especially if it's a woman scientist who is going out. Apart from that, I think one very important thing is that being very focused in terms of what you are doing. And this is something I've learned through doing it, because when you start conversing with a person, and if you're a talker and if you love conversations, you're going to go everywhere with the LEK study. You're going to talk about so many different things, and which is amazing in terms of understanding communities, but sometimes really makes you clouded in terms of what questions you are asking. So it'd be amazing to pilot your study to see the questions that you have set out, if it is working for the exact research you are interested in, if it is working, and stuff like that. I could only think, like, there are so many things that I could talk about, but I'm going to stop because I've talked so much. But yeah, I think one single biggest tip would be to overcome the challenges is preparation and design.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with all of this. And just to add, I think the way that one prepares for a study of people rather than a study of species is quite different. There are a lot of tips and tricks that you can take from, say, anthropology or any of these other disciplines where it perhaps matters less, the kind of equipment that you bring along with you and so on. And it matters more about how you present yourself and what you are like when you go out there to do the work. So your body language and all these kinds of things are actually an important part of the method and when you go out to do research with people. And associated with this is also ideas of ethics. Because we take a lot from these communities that we study, and often we don't actually give back very much. And I think this is also related to some of the questions that have come in today. But one of the things that, the social science training that I received encouraged me to do was to go back to the communities and present the results and sort of ask for suggestions of, given that I aggregated all your data and this is what I found. Does it make sense to you? What can I do from now on? And for me, in fact, this is where the fishers themselves kind of suggested that from the data that I had aggregated, it seemed like they were doing a lot of the things right. They were already thinking about sustainability. They were putting in these temporary fishing closures. They were doing a lot of the things right. And still, it seemed like our fisheries were still unsustainable. And so then they made the suggestion that I should perhaps look less at the fisheries and start looking more at the other parts of the supply chain. And that is, in fact, what I am doing now. And so I think going back to the community, asking for their inputs, acting on their suggestions. These are all ways in which we can improve, lives for the communities beyond just the research and the research papers. And hopefully this will have an actual impact on their lives. But the other important thing, I think, is, as I said earlier, one is to collaborate with actual social scientists who know how to do these things, particularly when you're dealing with, say, sensitive information, illegal trade, all these questions of, gray areas of ethics. In the social sciences, it's quite common for people to have a body that's like a ethics review committee to review their proposal and review their methods and suggest ways in which they can safely and ethically collect data even on these illegal activities, provided that the data is anonymized and cannot be traced back to individuals and so on. So there are various ways in which one can do that, and it would be best definitely to collaborate with someone who has some experience doing this, and to also have your methods reviewed by a board that is qualified to do so. So I think I'll stop here. And also just to say that if we have questions that we haven't answered, we will be available on day 4 to answer more of these questions. We are collating all of these questions so that we have a sense of what we got to and what we didn't, but we'll also be available to take further questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much for all your answers and all the time. I think that was everything for today. As Divya just said, we are collecting all these questions and we will address them on day 4 in the breakout sessions. I just wanted to remind all of you that tomorrow we will be talking about using citizen science for elasmobranch conservation. We will be starting at 11:30 GMT. But I would like to remind you that on the day 4, so the day after tomorrow, June 8th, we will be starting at 12:30 with these breakout sessions. I would also like to say thank you to all the speakers of today. So thank you very much, Divya, Alifa, and Trisha, for all your effort and showing us your super interesting work and experience about local ecological knowledge. Thank you also, everyone, all the participants of the workshop, for joining us today and for all your questions. All of them are very interesting and very good questions to discuss, and we will give them the time they need. And of course, also thank you very much to Divya and Hollie to organize this workshop. Yeah, I think that's everything. I don't know if someone wants to add anything else for today. Then thank you very much for joining, and see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Paula. See you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.